minutes at the end to ask maybe 2 questions. We decided that's really not what people need or want, so we are turning it on its head. We do have excellent speakers lined up both tonight and in the future, and you will get quite a bit of information out of them. But we're going to limit their talking to about 10 minutes apiece. And then for the rest of the time, we are opening it up to your questions for the speakers, and also some cross dialogue. So the idea is we want interaction. We want you to get your questions asked and answered because we think that's really the important thing of this program. So that's going to be a regular feature from now on, the last Thursday of each month, 7 o'clock Central Time. And I would point out that we already have our speakers lined up for probably the next 2 sessions. Next month in August, on the 27th, we will have Leona Morgan, who is a DINA activist in New Mexico with an organization called the Nuclear Issues Study Group. And she will be speaking on the topic of nuclear power as an environmental justice issue. After that, in September, we may be doing a presentation dealing with nuclear power in a COVID world, because we are finding all kinds of dangerous implications of operating nuclear plants with the COVID pandemic going on. So these are the future plans. This is the purpose of what we're doing here. And I'm going to divert a little bit from the script here just to point out this attendance tonight is really spectacular. We have people from coast to coast who are on the Zoom session tonight, which we wouldn't have had if we did it our traditional way. We have folks out in Washington State, I believe Georgia, and a couple folks from Georgia here, I think, yeah. And let's see, Tennessee, I do believe, is represented here tonight. Don't have his photo up, but Dave Lockbaum has joined us. And folks from all over the Illinois and Chicago area as well. So I want to welcome everyone, and maybe you'll get a chance to get to know each other a little bit better. You'll have an opportunity to talk with each other as well tonight. I'm pleased to say and very grateful that Dr. Norma Field and Dr. Yuki Miyamoto have been able to join us tonight. I've known both of them for quite some time now. We have worked together on the Fukushima disaster quite a bit, certainly have worked on the Tokyo No Olympics project and various other things over time. So it's been a real pleasure working and getting to know these 2 individuals. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about some of their background. Dr. Norma Field is a professor emerita at University of Chicago, Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. She's the author of In the Realm of a Dying Emperor, Japan at Century's End. She's the editor and co-translator of Fukushima Radiation, Will You Still Say No to Crime? Will you still say no, crime has been committed? And with Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, she maintains the Atomic Age website. And Dr. Yuki Miyamoto is the associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. The courses she regularly teaches at DePaul are the Atomic Bomb Discourse and the Atomic Age. She's led 2-week study groups abroad to Hiroshima and Nagasaki 7 times since 2005. She is the author of Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima. And I would also add that she is a 2nd-generation Hiroshima survivor. So that's my brief introduction. We've gone through the ground rules. I'm going to turn it over to the 2 doctors, and you now have you now have the floor. Have you decided who is going first?
Oh, we haven't, but I've just decided I would. Is that okay, Yuki?
Perfect.
All right. Okay. I really want to thank Dave for giving us this occasion to head off this new series. And it's not, it's customary to thank your host, but as I was thinking today, it's a very specific kind of thanks I want to give to Dave. and also the cohort of the Nuclear Energy Information Service supporters, his board, who have sustained this activity. So back in June of 2011, Dave and I were sitting in the Quadrangle Club of the University of Chicago, and there were eminent physicists and other people involved in nuclear power. And the point of this session was essentially to tell us it was all okay. I mean, I don't think this group would be surprised to know that was the purpose of convening the experts and having us listen to why they thought it was okay. And at the end of it, I was just, in a way, stunned by a huge absence. And since Dave and I were sitting next to each other, mercifully, I said, Dave, where were the people? Because absolutely no human beings just did not show up in this magnificent, authoritative discussion of why we shouldn't be bothered about or truly deeply anxious in any way about Fukushima nuclear power. And every time since then, when I feel overwhelmed by trying to tackle anything about the nuclear age, I go back to my asking Dave, and Dave reinforcing in so many ways what an essential question that is, where are the people? You know, we're often told that when we want to understand something, follow the money. I think it's absolutely necessary to follow the money, and we also have to follow the people. And they're usually not in the same places, or they're not locatable in the same frame. And I was just thinking about that yesterday. I'm not a regular or avid consumer of Twitter, but I was watching a friend's retweeting something, and I want to share. It was by Sarah Fox, and if you don't know, can you see that?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Yeah. This is Sarah Fox is a wonderful young historian, and she wrote a book called Downwind: A People's History of the Nuclear West. So you can imagine it's a wonderful book, an impassioned oral history of the survivors of the Nevada test site and their horrific lives. And after July 16th, the anniversary of the Trinity bombing and the Church Rock uranium spill in New Mexico, she was quoting, I believe, a White House statement on July 16th, coming out on Trinity. Quote, "This remarkable feat of engineering and scientific ingenuity was the culmination of the Manhattan Project, which helped end World War II and launch an unprecedented era of global stability, innovation, and economic prosperity." That's what Trinity has brought us. And Sarah was tweeting that it's a terrible insult and injustice to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Tularosan Basin downwinders, whose region was contaminated by the Trinity test, and about whom we have developed curiosity only in the last few years, and the tens of thousands of people around the globe whose homes and food supplies and bodies were poisoned by radiation exposure, from thousands of subsequent nuclear weapons tests in Nevada, Kazakhstan, the Marshall Islands, Australia, Alaska, French Polynesia, China, India, Pakistan, and not to mention those poisoned by their proximity to plutonium production sites, Hanford, Oak Ridge, Rocky Flats, and the thousands of uranium mines and mills developed to fuel this violent technology, as well as the victims of nuclear accidents like the Rio Puerto spill, that's Church Rock, and the power plant accidents at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Trump's statement, she says, is a sort of violent nationalist erasure of history that needs to be combated with the stories of impacted people, communities, and places. So I'm just in my little time, I'll try to monitor myself. You can cut me off, Dave. You can mute me, I bet. I just want to share my orientation to this problem with you, which is that there is no such thing as us versus them. Whatever the excuses, the grand falsehoods meant to justify the development and maintenance and perhaps renewal of nuclear weapons, it is not possible to engage in any kind of nuclear anything production, energy, or weapons without impacting people on your so-called side or in the community that power is supposed to benefit. So that is one really important principle. Another thing I want to say, since we're so close to it, and maybe Yuki will have more to say specifically, she should, she's a real expert. There was a great judgment, good news. How long has it been since you got some of that? On July 29th in Japan in Hiroshima District Court. It's called the Black Rain lawsuit. I bet most people on this call, on this webinar, know what black rain is. It's the rain that fell in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped, where all the soot and other, the product of the fires and the radionuclides were swept together up into the clouds, to that mushroom cloud, and then fell again. The Japanese government, of course, is very grudgingly, I think this is always true, acknowledged the victims of the atomic bombs only grudgingly by drawing close concentric circles and then maybe increasing them by a 50% of a kilometer. In 1976, I believe, they also grudgingly, again, defined an area where black rain was said to have fallen and said people who live there could get acknowledged too. This lawsuit, this was the day it's a very emotional occasion in Japan, these public, I'm going to interrupt myself, these large, high-profile social cause lawsuits, the day of judgment. It's even in our digital age, usually one of the younger lawyers, I'm told, on the team will come running out and unfurl a banner that will say something like unjust defeat, or in this case, total victory. And it thrills my heart right now just to see it on my screen share, to imagine what this moment is 75 years after the fact, with these aging plaintiffs, the youngest ones being in their 70s, the older ones in their 90s, many among their group already having died while pleading to get their case recognized. So this was a case where the judge said all 84 plaintiffs should be recognized as hibakusha, as people who had suffered from being exposed to black rain outside the limits that had been defined. That's very important to say that the central government defined limits were not final. But here's the thing that is important for all the people Sarah Fox was pointing to earlier, certainly for Fukushima too, and 3 Mile Island and Hanford and all those. The judge also said these people it's not just people who actually had the black rain fall on them, but people who ingested it through water that was contaminated or ate food from the plants that were watered by the black rain. So this is really a historic decision by District Court of Hiroshima saying there is such a thing as internal contamination. It is not just being hit from the outside by rays or rain, but you can take it inside yourself, and that has serious consequences. This is the last thing the Japanese government or the US government or anybody else in the official nuclear regime wants to acknowledge, because once you start recognizing what happens when you take in radionuclides, how long-term that is. And there's quite an extraordinary figure. If any of you are interested, you can contact me, from Nagasaki, where the tissue from an autopsy of a woman who died, can't remember when, I don't know if it was very early on or not, it's a very difficult thing, I'm told technically, to show the traces of the plutonium contained in her tissue. But anyway, this is the kind of thing the authorities don't want to recognize. So this is a historic moment. One quick other image I'd like to share with you. This very important report. It goes along with my No Us versus Them. This was put together by then Congressman, now the junior senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey, 1986. And the title is "Such Honesty and Accuracy Are Very Refreshing. American Nuclear Guinea Pigs, 3 Decades of Radiation Experiments on US Citizens." And many of the institutions that we know about will show up there. For me, the University of Chicago, where I taught for 30 years, where students and staff between 61 and 64 were experimented again through ingestion, because people have been interested, the authorities have been interested in what the impact of ingesting radionuclides is. So they were given either fabricated materials or the fallout from an actual test, the small boy shot. It's very interesting. One of the last of the atmospheric nuclear weapons. And on this side, you can see the soldiers who have to do it, and the other side, the spectators. I think it's very interesting to think about what could have happened there and on the campus. Perhaps it was at Argonne. I don't know if it was at the Hyde Park campus or not, but yes, there are many, many, many American nuclear guinea pigs. And so with that, I really, I want to turn it over to Yuki and say, I'm so grateful to her in so many ways. And because the book that Dave mentioned has such a, is so good, so gets at the point beyond the mushroom cloud. The legacy of the atomic bombs has encouraged us to fixate on the mushroom cloud and never think about what happened under it and what has happened beyond it. Beautiful photograph taken, I believe, by a good friend of hers. Anyway, Yuki has supported me, has gone to Fukushima with me several times. She helped organize a trip whereby we brought a survivor from Nagasaki, where she has taken many students. Here I have an image of that too. This is Richland High School, the home of the bombers. And this is Yuki here and Yuki here, actually, where we guided a Nagasaki survivor in his 80s to visit the site where the plutonium for the bomb that destroyed his hometown was manufactured. And our point was, we really wanted it to be a two-way exchange. We wanted the people who lived in Richland and the other communities there to perhaps understand their own victimization by their government, as well as to learn about what the impact of the bomb from the plutonium produced on their end, what it had done on the other side of the Pacific. So with that, I want to turn it over to Yuki. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, for such a generous introduction of me. I'm very honored to be here and to be credited as an expert and to be with Norma as a guest speaker. So thank you so much, Dave. I wish that I had a nice episode of how I got to know Dave, how we worked together. But as my dad would say, you know, I thoroughly remember, I forget things. So I'm sorry. I do not have nice episodes, although we have been working together for a long time. And then Black Rain, and actually Norma nicely captured what the meaning of that trial. And I was hoping that Norma would talk about it. So what I want to do today is, since I was born in Hiroshima, grew up there, and with my mother who experienced the atomic bombing. So I would like to start my experiences there, or the experiences of my family members. And I would like to tie it into what's going on in Fukushima. And the reason is that very recently, most of my experiences and ideas came from Norma, so forgive me. But, and also, I don't have nice photos, images, so you have to bear with me, like showing myself here for 10 minutes, next 10 minutes. But recently we had attended a certain event, and we were reminded again and again and again that how difficult it is to talk about radiation in Fukushima. And we had known that, but it was just fresh reminder that how hard, and especially for scholars like us, if you talk about radiation, if you use the term radiation, you can't even you can't penetrate into local communities. You can't, if you are an ethnographer, you cannot do anything. And big part of it is the fear of discrimination. And I think that's something I can talk from my experiences. And before that, just briefly, let me explain about my mother. She was born in 1939. So at the time of the bombing, she was 6 years old. And even though August 6th in Hiroshima, even though August 6th was, I guess now, not present day, summer break, but back then every kids were going to school. My mother was in this elementary school, and that building was, thank God, that was built in concrete, and she was inside. So even though it was only 1.6 kilometers away, and actually her health book says 1.6 kilometers because she applied to the health book because she said she had been at home. But actually she was at school, which was closer to the hypocenter. So approximately it is 1.2 kilometer around there. But she was in a concrete building, which saved her life at the moment. However, and then like forwarded in her life, in her 30s, she had some like dizzy spells all the time. She was not able to stand up. She was often lying down. She was having a hard time in doing chores at home. And in her 40s, which I didn't know, when she was lying at home, I knew that she was not doing well. I was trying to help her, not as much, but trying. And in her 40s, which I didn't know, was that she was going to clinic every other week to receive this sort of blood booster shots, because she has very little blood. Her blood system was not able to produce healthy blood. So she had to do that, which she didn't tell me. I didn't know much about her experiences, not just on the day of the bombing, but throughout. She didn't tell me. And the reason was she was concerned about me being discriminated against as the second generation of hibakusha, and especially as a woman, being barren and infertile. So those things were important, especially in older Japanese system household, bringing son who can carry on the family names, having healthy children. That was much more valued before, like in the 50s, 60s. And for that reason, she didn't tell me about her experiences, and because of that discrimination. And my cousins, on my mother's side, there are two cousins, who are 12 years older than I am. So in the 70s, they were in their early 20s. They took a trip together to Osaka, coming back on the bullet train. And they just struck up a conversation with a stranger who happened to be sitting next to them, to my cousins. And then they were having a good chat. But then Hiroshima station approached, and they were trying to leave, and then the stranger asked them, "So are you from Hiroshima? Were you in any ways related to the bombing?" So they said very casually, "Well, our mother, who witnessed the atomic bombing." And then all of a sudden, this stranger, this man's attitude changed, and kind of in a very cold tone, told my cousins, "You don't think you can get married, do you?" And that was very shocking to my cousins, especially they were in their early 20s. And fortunately, I don't remember my personal experiences that I received discrimination against in growing up in the 70s and 80s in Hiroshima. Especially in the city, everyone has one or two family members who are affected by the bomb. So it was not a very particular thing in growing up. However, later on, when I started researching more about this historical event, what I discovered was quite shocking. In 1976, at the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, one member proposed that hibakusha should have, what's the word, not sanitarized, it's not able to have conceive the kids. What's the word I'm looking for here?
Sterilized?
Sterilized, thank you, sterilized. So this member proposed that hibakusha should sterilize so that no more the second generations. And this was, of course, this didn't pass. This bill didn't pass. However, the member who proposed this bill was a very respected member who was a medical doctor. And even after this statement, he was elected 4 times consecutively to be a member of this Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly. So that's the kind of attitude still in the 70s. And I think that became underpinnings people's attitude toward people who have witnessed or who have contact with radiation, and definitely speaks to what is going on in Fukushima. And I also have another concerns, which is recently doctors, I think more than one, could be one, medical doctor was arrested because he assisted this ALS patient. And a couple of years ago, there was a guy who killed a lot of patients at the institution where ALS patients or other physically challenged and mentally challenged patients were killed by this guy. And then still that starred, not controversy, that starred people's emotions. And it's because this perpetrator said, well, they were useless and they were eating up our taxes, so I did a good thing. He had no remorse. And then this new incident that the medical doctor assisted suicide of ALS patient. And I have not pursued thoroughly, but it seems like this ALS patient, and she was not the first that this doctor assisted. And so this ALS patient was not the first, and she might not even wanted to die. So against her will, this medical doctor might have performed mercy killing. So what I am concerned right now, given those incidents, is that in Japan, and I'm afraid elsewhere, those people who are considered as not contributing to this capitalism society, they were considered as useless and not worth living. And so that sort of attitude certainly contributed to people in Fukushima talking about their health concerns, their anxieties about living with radiation. And they cannot even talk about it, use this word of radiation, which is a concern, which is a serious concern to me. But I still don't know how to approach, because I also want to talk with those people who might be in self-denial. So therefore, my presentation or my chat here is more like to pose what we can do, what is going on. And when it comes to Fukushima, Norma can talk, inform us a lot. So I'm hoping that Norma as another guest speaker, and as well as the audience, we can discuss, at least we can use this term radiation here, so we can talk about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for your stories, for your time, and now for the question and answer. Before I do that, I do want to make two other recognitions here. We have a couple of co-hosts who are board members of NEIS I'd like to introduce to you. So Kathleen Rood, if you would go on speaker view, people can see who you are, I hope.
Hello.
No, well, maybe not, okay.
Huh?
I thought everyone would be able to see you. And also Gail Stein, it's my ex-supervisor. Gail Snyder, who is our board president, is a co-host.
Hi.
And she's here laughing at me right now. So, all right, again, it's time to take stack. They're gonna help keep order, and we ask one person at a time speak, and the floor is now yours. So Mary, you're first up.
Okay, I just first want to thank Norma and Yuki for your incredible focal points that you brought, news I haven't heard. Thank you so much. Thank you, NEIS. As you can tell, I'm also saying I can't stay very much longer. And as a result, I'm just going to break the rules like usual and say that there's a mega virtual commemoration going on, 9 hours on the 6th and on the 9th of live stream. And you can find out more about it at HiroshimaNagasaki75.org. And it's a compendium of over 200 organizations making this happen. I'm not actually recommending that anyone watch anything for 9 hours. And I think that this conversation tonight is far more fruitful. So with that, I will be quiet and say thank you, Dave, so much. And no, I'll stay a few more minutes, but I can't stay to the end to make the announcement.
And Mary, if you could type that link again into the chat box, we'll have it for everybody so that they can access it later. All right. Anyone else want to be on stack to ask a question or make a comment? Type stack into the chat box and we'll get you unmuted. Okay, Kathleen's up.
Great, thanks. I'm wondering what you're talking about, the stigma of even saying radiation in Fukushima. And so is this, so what's happening there with the people and them getting tested, being told to move back into areas that are contaminated? And what's the status now of people who had been impacted, and you know, are they tracking health issues? Are they forcing people back where they shouldn't be? Interested in what the update is.
Oh dear. Hold on there, Norma. Somehow we got you muted again. We'll take care of that in a minute. Hang on. Here we go. Okay, so you should be able to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Great question. So the Japanese government, first of all, you might recall the Japanese government started with, 3 kilometers concentric circle for evacuation. So finally it went up to 20, and between 20 and 30 you were supposed to shelter in place. But it was already by the end of 2011. So within 9 months of the disaster, it started reopening areas. There was mandatory evacuation and voluntary evacuation. I know voluntary evacuation is a contradiction in terms, but I will use it because it represents very well the kinds of ridiculous conundrums government policy, which is to minimize acknowledgement, drove people into. There is that on this, and a number of those A number of evacuees remain outside Fukushima. There was also evacuation within Fukushima itself. And in many ways that was preposterous. I met a poet actually who was under mandatory evacuation. He lived in the coastal area where the reactors are. And he looked at the measurements at the site of his evacuation. I think it was in Fukushima City, the prefectural capital. And he decided his own home had lower rates. So he just up and went back home. But in any case, evacuation is one thing. Mandatory evacuees received support. Everyone got something for general disaster relief, but the government's principle had some carrots to draw people back. If you come back now, you're going to get X number of yen for resettlement and so many coupons at the local supermarket, that kind of thing. And if you don't come back, your housing assistance, all of that will be cut off. And simultaneously, progressively opening up the zones and having to tamper with internationally acknowledged levels for the general population of what is to be tolerated. The general rule is no more than 1 millisievert a year of exposure. This is the adult population we're talking about, of course. Occupational is what? More than 50 in any 1 year and 100 over 5 years, meaning 20 millisievert a year on average for occupational exposure. The Japanese government has unilaterally said, you know what, 20 millisievert per year exposure is okay for people. It's not really going to cause any damage. There are lawsuits about that. So that is on the one hand. On the other hand, there is something called the Fukushima Prefectural Health Survey, which was to monitor everyone, and particularly the one form of cancer grudgingly acknowledged in Chernobyl, which is thyroid cancer for children and youth. And so there is the annual pediatric, it's not annual, it's now in stage 4 or 5, Yuki would know, of anyone 0 to 18 who was living in Fukushima at the time. Now, it turned up with very high numbers, right? Pediatric thyroid cancer has been considered an extremely rare form of cancer. It turned up with high numbers, so every time you have these grown-ups in their suits and ties, the committee that oversees this meeting and then announcing, this is a pretty literal translation, and it is difficult to think that the thyroid youth and pediatric thyroid cancers that have emerged have anything to do with the nuclear disaster. So that is the official line. And we also have experts kicking in, and this is getting to your question and what Yuki said about all the taboo against referring to radiation. So the experts have also begun to say, you know what, this just testing produces anxiety. And to what good? Because everybody knows youth and pediatric childhood thyroid cancer usually doesn't amount to anything. We really should cut down. And they've done various subtle things so that you could start checking in the form that comes to your house. You can say, no, I really don't want my child to be tested. So in the name of free self-expression, to encourage rejection of having your child continue to be tested. As we all know, if you don't test for something, you're probably not going to find it, especially if it's child thyroid cancer. And so there is that kind of repression. Now, of course, there are people in Fukushima who speak about radiation and who speak about exposure. There's another famous, very, very important lawsuit that just finished the hearings and awaits a judgment next March, which is for children, children to protect children from radiation exposure. This is actually, I think it is the only lawsuit that directly puts radiation exposure in its name. This is what our lawsuit is about. We are concerned about radiation exposure, and we insist that the state honor the child's right, for Japanese citizens' right to live in a safe environment. So this is another important case that's coming up. My own thought about the reluctance to talk about radiation is that it is so powerful, and whatever Japanese however much the memory, the knowledge about Hiroshima and Nagasaki have faded over 75 years, it is something that puts the fear of radiation in people's minds. And when you have that profound a fear, and you also feel powerless to do something about it, most people would rather not think about it, and they would also prefer their neighbors not to talk about it. So there's an enormous amount of self-silencing and mutual surveillance, which I understand and find deadly.
And if I could add, you know, I was going to talk about Tarachine Mother's Lab, which also Norma introduced me to. So she knows people working there. So those are the people who are testing or examining how much radiation is in the food, and also they studied recently, or maybe a year or 2 years ago already, but they studied this test about water, ocean water, right? Like radiation, radioactive.
Tritium. Yeah.
Right.
And other beta, strontium, etc. too. You're right.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So there are people who are trying to not necessarily raise cautions, but also they are showing examples that they know that there is radiation. We are living with radiation. However, and I just don't want to blame just only media, because I know that education industry or schools and also teachers, myself, to some extent complicit. And then there are, like for example, the Japanese government was paying some money to high school and the college teachers to visit Fukushima. And the places they are taking their students to are the people who are resilient and who knows that it's danger, but we are resilient, we are not being defeated. And so they're willingly to stay in Fukushima and sort of portray them as a hero. Despite this hardship, they chose to stay. So the narrative pattern is very much like to praise them, praise their life patterns. And so, and that, of course, at the same time, what this kind of narrative does is to undermine and downplay the danger of radiation. So when that sort of idea or narrative patterns dominate, it's harder to go against. And I think right now, I was rereading the most recent Norma's article on the Asia Pacific Journal, and that details how, you know, if you talk about radiation, that's immediately linked into, oh, you are discriminating against the people. So you are the perpetrator. You are the one who actually creates, maintains this discriminatory pattern. So I highly recommend this article, but and I will send the link later. So I think all those things were definitely woven into the stigma and people's fear of even voicing or even using the term of radiation in Fukushima.
Yeah, I just, along the theme of how it is, there's no us versus them, but one of the things that Yuki and I experienced when we took our Nagasaki survivor to the B reactor in Hanford was it had until recently been pretty much off limits to 16-year-olds. And I guess they decided that was way too restrictive. And now we were told that eventually, since it was going to be, it is part of the Manhattan Project National Park plan, it was going to be opened up, and fourth graders, I think, from Washington State were all going to be encouraged to visit the B reactor, which was the site of plutonium production. And I don't think I need to tell you how long the half-life of plutonium might be, or why we might not feel inclined to take the Department of Energy's word on how it's completely cleaned up.
Okay, we have 3 people who are on stack. I'll read them off and we'll take them one at a time, and then I have a question at the end. We have Kevin Camps. Roberta has a question about a book. And Stephanie then has a question. So Kevin, you've been unmuted. Go for it.
Yep, thanks, Dave. My question's for Norma. You mentioned Trinity and Church Rock, and I know you have connections with the Pueblo near Los Alamos. So I just wondered if you'd talk about your New Mexico connections.
Hi, thanks for asking that, Kevin. This is another of the things I have to thank Dave for, and you for, really. In fact, it was about 30 years ago. The first time, it was an embarrassing experience for me to learn in Japan from activists in Nagasaki how many nuclear sites were around Native American reservations. I had no idea of that 30 years ago. But I had no personal connection to it until much more recently. And it really began with NEIS and others sponsoring the Mountain of Nuclear Waste at the 70th conference, at 70th anniversary of the Fermi experiment. And that's when I met Robert Chavez, who belongs to 2 pueblos down National Laboratory. Yuki did too, and Charmaine Whiteface on Lakota, who's worked a long time on uranium mines. It is, I will never forget Robert, who was the youngest participant. I will never forget how he began. He was the first speaker of the morning, and I happened to be chairing his panel. And we were in that cavernous space in International House at the University of Chicago. And he just got up and started saying, I think he said something like, what would it be like? Imagine what it would be like if you got up and you turned on the tap to get a drink of water first thing in the morning, and you know that water isn't safe. Or you just want to take a huge gulp of fresh air, and you know that's not safe either. You're introducing harmful things into your lungs. And this was 2012, right? Just a year after Fukushima. And what stunned me was how the exact same things were said about Fukushima. And to have this young man take on this large audience and immediately bring us an embodied experience, one that each one of us could understand. And that for me, preoccupied as I was with Fukushima, that it instantly connected me to that site too. Was amazing. And so meeting him and his mother, Marian Naranjo, who's also a very fine potter and a long-term activist, was really an important, very, very important introduction to me to what it's like to live in the shadow of a laboratory and learn in ways that you can't read about, like how much contamination there is in the skating rink for the privileged children of the labs there, that kind of thing, how toxic it is for everyone. I also want to say I'm grateful to Dave and for bringing us together with Leona Morgan, who's going to be the expert next month, and the Nuclear Issues Study Group. And Yuki and I watched the webinar of that group done by her and Eileen Shaughnessy a couple of weeks ago. And that was a threshold experience for me to have people who are much younger than we're accustomed to seeing at Nuclear Anything running the show and speaking from their immediate and proximate experiences and connecting us to Africans, mostly located in South Africa, but working on the uranium mining issue in the former Belgian Congo, how timely that is, right? The King Leopold statue is being dragged down and so forth. I mean, all of these things do come together. And there was the youngest participant then was a 19-year-old, Talo Fuambe, maybe, don't hold me to that. But he shared with us a music video and he had composed it. And the lines that I can't get out of my mind were, you all talk about Hiroshima, you never talk about Shinkolobwe. Shinkolobwe is the name of the uranium mine. And that just went straight to my heart and turned my brain inside out. And I absolutely do not think that that diminishes Hiroshima. In fact, it expands it. You know, it expands it by placing it in this great chain of harm that has been inflicted on living things on the earth, and through this music video reminds us how many people, if you are familiar with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, every year there's general lamentation about how all the hibakusha are aging and dying out. Who's going to keep on with their story? And the Nuclear Issues Study Group based in Albuquerque made me say, well, there you are, all these people who have already taken up the story from different parts of the world, and we are reinforcing each other. So that's just a bit about my ties, learning about the nuclear Southwest.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just add a piece. Norma referenced a conference. It was the 70th anniversary of the first chain reaction, and Kevin Camps and several other of us put together a conference called, A Mountain of Waste 70 Years High. It was a 2-day conference at the University of Chicago, and Norma was our keynote speaker, one of the keynote speakers we had. And we do have all of the tapes from that conference on the NEIS website. And she mentioned the very first session, which had Robert Chavez and Charmaine Whiteface. It set the tone for the weekend completely. It was a blockbuster. So if you'd like to see the remarks of those people on that panel, it is on the NEIS website in the video section. And when I complete the chat box, I'll make sure to put the link in there so you can reference it. Roberta, I don't have your last name, but you had a question about a book. So let's see if we can get you unmuted and you can ask your
Excuse me. There we go. Actually, it's Don sitting here on at my side. I'm closer to the keyboard. It's his question.
I read this book, A Song for Nagasaki. You're familiar with that, Yuki? The story
Yes.
of Takashi Nagai.
Yes, yes.
Could you expand on that a little?
Okay, sure. Nagai Takashi is a medical doctor in Nagasaki. He was not a native of Nagasaki. He came to Nagasaki to go to a medical university there. And he, he was born with Catholic family, and then that's how he converted to Catholic. And because Nagasaki's Catholic community had been discriminated against, especially during the war when the emperor cult was on the surge. So as a medical doctor, he was very much respected in the community, even though he's a newcomer. And then he went to China twice as a medical doctor, accompanying the military units. But when he came back,
in radiation, he was
right. He was. Sorry, I'm giving Nagai Takashi's life story here. But he was actually a radiologist, so he had been diagnosed with leukemia even before 1945 Nagasaki bombing, and he lost his wife to the bombing. He was almost dying. But after the experiences, 3 months later, his former student visited him coming back from the battlefield, and he found out that his whole family had been gone. So he was asking Nagai, how can we think of this? Because, you know, people are saying in the city, Nagasaki Hypocenter is a little bit outskirts of the Nagasaki city back then. Now it's a part of Nagasaki city. So the city people, which was relatively less damaged, they were saying that the bomb was dropped onto Nagasaki Catholics. It's because they were worshiping a different god from us. And is that true? Is that why, you know, my family had been killed? And so Nagai's answer was that, no, it's actually those people who were killed by the bomb were unblemished lambs. They were innocent, so that's why they were taken away by God. Those people who survived, we were the ones who failed the entrance exam to the heaven. And so we had to do more good deed. So that's the, so it's more like thank God for the atom bomb, the same kind of line of thought. And this was actually presented at the Requiem Mass in November 1945 at the church. So think that if that the congregation, in that context, it can be embraced, but of course it has some problems, you know, like sort of exonerating the perpetrator from the deed, exonerating others from, or exalting those Nagasaki Catholics. So, which means like those who are unblemished lambs, but what about other, you know, other deaths from the air raid and Hiroshima bombs? And so it raises so many questions. And even among the Catholic people, Nagai's understanding is a little bit controversy, but still inside the Catholic community in Nagasaki was well embraced.
What was interesting to me was one of the first things I learned was that the bomb was not supposed to be dropped on Nagasaki.
Right. The target city was Kokura. However, Kokura was covered with the cloud, and the crew was told to use the eyesight rather than radar, and the visibility was bad in Kokura. So they decided they had three choices, I suppose. One is to return to Tinian Island where they took off, or drop the bomb in the ocean. And the third is go to the next target. And of course, the the very first one is too dangerous to bring back the bomb to the Tinian Island. The second one is waste of the tax money and everything. So the third one seemed to them a viable option. So they went to Nagasaki, and all of a sudden, Nagasaki was not, visibility-wise, it was not ideal, but at the moment, the cloud parted and then they could see. The actual target was at Mitsubishi shipyard because they were making battleships. However, what happened was the bomb was drifted a little and it exploded between the valley, between the mountains. And even though Hiroshima bomb is uranium and Nagasaki bomb is plutonium, as a theory, plutonium bomb was more powerful, but because of the fewer population between the mountains and less populated area of Catholics and other discriminated groups. So death rate amounted to the half of Hiroshima death toll. However, the amount, it was more powerful bomb, which was dropped in Nagasaki.
Thank you.
Okay, we have three people on the stack. We have Stephanie, and then Gail and Linda. Stephanie, you're up.
Hi. The only American president that has visited Hiroshima, it was President Obama. I, as an American, feel much sadness about those bombs. So him visiting, and I should have looked up his actual speech and I didn't. So what what are the feelings of the Japanese people in regards to, I don't know, what happened? What happened? I mean, what is their thoughts on it?
Oh, me. I'll start. He was the only he's the first and only sitting president. It was
Oh,
Carter
okay.
went after he stopped being, I mean, he was, yeah, he left the presidency.
That's right.
We had, I mean, it depends, of course, it depends on whom you ask. It was very, of course, it was very controversial, right? I mean, you knew, I mean, anything Obama did was going to be opposed by many politicians in the United States. There's that factor. And he was going to have to be extremely careful as to what he said. He chose to visit in the month of May rather than the anniversary month of August. I say that's a good thing because at least it meant that people were thinking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki twice in 1 year instead of just in August. The most controversial aspect of his talk is the line, "Death fell from the skies." We all know that death didn't fall from the skies. There, you know, it was a huge budget and a lot of scientific power that planned to have death fall from the skies. So from intellectuals, politically conscious people, there was enormous criticism about that. Yuki will probably have much more firsthand contact, but I remember speaking to several Hiroshima survivors, and I was really humbled and a little bit embarrassed by my own high, mighty attitude, because they were simply grateful to have a sitting president of the United States come. And so even, you know, they weren't going to be so critical about the content of the speech. And I suppose one could say they were being forgiving and understanding about why he couldn't say anything that would hint of an apology. But I bet Yuki has more to say on this.
Not much to add, but I think that's so true that first of all, this disproportionate amount of information, for example, in Hiroshima especially, everyone knows Prague's speech that Obama made in 2009 about the abolition of nuclear weapons, whereas here in the United States, not many actually thought about it. Or at least my students, not many of my students knew about Prague's speech. So that's the first point. And the second point is that's definitely true what Norma informed us. And that's especially, I think, generational differences. Most of the Hibakusha had been fighting for recognition even within their country. So it is a huge thing for them to have recognition from the United States, from the sitting president. So that itself was such a joy for them. But of course, as Norma said, I was also embarrassed, and you know, yeah, I'm on you know, high ground, telling them like you shouldn't be so pleased. You know, that's really not right. But at the same time, I also want to point out that this is also a kind of very prevalent image in Japan that President Obama hugged a person in front of the cenotaph in Hiroshima Peace Park. And why that person attended at the ceremony there, it's because he was researching on American POWs who were killed by the bombing. So in a way that it's a of course a gesture of reconciliation, but at the same time, it's not necessarily with Japanese victims.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. We have Linda, Gail, and then Jan.
So I read about this TEPCO case that TEPCO came out and admitted all of their responsibility in Fukushima. And I wondered if you could, both of you, speak a little more about Did I get that right? What happened? Isn't that amazing to me that TEPCO would say mea culpa, you know, in public, or it was a decision, or however it was said, you know, and what the repercussions for that have in terms of the subject matter tonight?
I'm trying to think of what you might be referring to, because it would be a glorious day if TEPCO admitted its responsibility. It
Well, I think
has.
yeah.
I'm just trying to think what you might be referring to. I mean, it's admitted certain things, like, you know, 3 months later, yes, there was a meltdown, for instance. But to say, that's not the same as
It was a
admitting
case. It was all right. Well, anyway, I'll follow it down at another time. Sure.
I would love to know it. So if you figure out what it was you're referring to, please email me. I'd love to know.
Like many things, I think I heard it through Kevin, so I'll go back to him.
Oh, maybe we should go after Kevin. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Gail, you're next.
So I'm curious if the Ukraine area that was impacted by the Chernobyl accident, if you have any kind of information or comparisons about this kind of reluctance to talk about radiation and stigma to, you know, the Japanese culture and the culture there, very different cultures. But I'm just wondering if you've done any comparisons as to how socially, is it the same situation exactly in Ukraine with people, you know, not wanting to talk about it? Anyway, I just thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit. Either of you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting issue. Dave might know more directly, but my sense is in Svetlana Alexievich's book that got her the Nobel Prize in Literature a few years ago, there is reference to one of her oral history subs offering apples to a neighbor or something and saying, you know, it's really good because I know they're not going to throw it away the minute I turn my back. Whereas because everybody knows they're in a contaminated area and they're not going to throw away offerings from each other. I've also gotten the sense that many people are just want to declare that we're done. You know, this is done, moving on, and it's not something where we want to be talking about anymore. There are many other. I mean, Japanese activists are avidly connected with and study about both Ukraine and Belarus. But Dave, did you want to say anything from your own contacts about how the subject is treated there?
Yeah, a couple of things. Within 5 years of the Chernobyl disaster, there were members of NEIS who were just getting into community video and got the idea that it would be really interesting if we could interview some of the refugees who have come from Ukraine, most of whom were Jewish, and interview them about the disaster. And they were completely stonewalled. They got nowhere with anyone. They got nowhere in the Ukrainian community, which is fairly sizable here in Chicago. And the general feeling was that, for those people, was that they came here to get away from it. They don't want to hear about it anymore. They want to put it, like you said, they want to put it in their past. They don't want to deal with it in any way, shape, or form. The Ukrainian community here is in a very unusual situation, that many, if not most of the transactions are business oriented. So you really don't want to say anything that would cross the government and screw up your chances to do business in Ukraine. So they have been very reluctant to get involved or comment on the Chernobyl situation at all. Just the last piece I'll throw out is a wonderful experience we did have, and again, we have some good memories of this and some photos. A local Chicago author, Irene Zabitko, wrote a fictional book called The Sky Unwashed about the the old women from around the Chernobyl disaster region who were so mistreated by the Soviet government after they were relocated and displaced. They just said, to hell with it, we're going to go back home. And they have gone back to live in the contaminated zone illegally. But they figure, if I'm going to die, I want to die where I feel comfortable and where I really want to be. So it's a real hodgepodge of attitudes. The crazy thing is now, you know, the zone, as they call it, is still, you know, fenced off and prohibited. But at the same time, they've allowed the creation of a tourist industry to take tourists through it. So go figure, you know. Actually, there is a point that was just raised I wanted to come to from that question, and that is the attitude of the Japanese government. We had talked about this last year amongst our planning for the Tokyo Olympics, which did not occur this year. But I think, Yuki, you were the one who accidentally realized that had the Olympics gone forward, the very last day of the Olympics would have been August 9th, the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Nagasaki. And the question I want to raise here is your comments about, is the Japanese government in this position now of saying it's over? You know, nuclear is behind us, we want to move on, gambaro and all that stuff, you know, and what are your thoughts on that? Is this a whitewash? Are we moving forward?
Yes, thank you. Well, let me go back a little bit about Chernobyl, because I was thinking of the same movie which Norma and I watched together. I saw it together at the theater, and that's the same pattern. You know, people who stayed in the contaminated area, they were more cheerful and they are courageous, whereas those people who evacuated, they were uprooted, miserable. And so that kind of narrative pattern is the same in Fukushima. And I was also going to ask Norma about to talk about Dr. Yamashita, who actually was in Chernobyl, knows about what was going on, trying to help people there. But then when after Fukushima happened, he totally did different things. So maybe I'd rather Norma, if she's okay with it, I would like her to talk about it. But going back to what you were saying, Dave, the closure thing, I don't know if I said that or once again I stole Norma's idea, but yes, it seems like it's the I don't think it's coincidence. It seems like it's well orchestrated plan that this Olympics especially, and I also once again I would like to remind Norma's recent article talking about how this Olympics is used to cover up the reality, but to paint the image of restoration, recovery. We overcame any kind of hardships, even radiation contamination, even from 75 years ago, even from 9 years ago. So I think this closure, what they were planning, they meaning the Abe administration and the Olympic Committee were planning to do was to put a closing of Olympics on August 9th, declaring to the world that we are done. Japan is done with radiation, and that's my interpretation. And especially on August 6th and 9th, since in the 90s, Prime Minister comes to Hiroshima or Nagasaki or both to attend the ceremonies. That seems to be since 90s on their annual events. But if closing took place, if closing had taken place on August 9th this year, then Abe wouldn't have been there. So it's also another gesture that my absence is that I prioritize the Olympics. And so that's my thoughts.
Norma, did you want to weigh in on that at all? Oh, we got you on mute again. Hang on. I thought that was taken off.
Nope.
There you
Yeah.
go. You got it.
Just quickly, I mean, we're done with radiation, as Yuki put it, is exactly it. The Japanese government has often said, as the only A-bombed nation in the world, which A is inaccurate because it wasn't the nation that was A-bombed, it was 2 cities, which is a really important point. They're absolutely fond of saying that, but we'll have, as I've mentioned before, try to minimize any kind of not just aid, but recognition of who might count as a Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivor. And as Yuki mentioned, of course, they're American POWs, but we have to remember people from Japan's former colonies, Koreans, Chinese, etc. So all of that. But in any case, the minimization of recognition, as our late and wonderful friend Jeff Patterson said, scum, right? Whenever we're involved with nuclear, there is A, the first policy is secrecy. And second, if there's any threat to that secrecy, you minimize whatever the target of that threat is. And finally, if all else fails, you cover up, hence scum. It applies to every aspect of nuclear anything. And the Japanese government is no exception. And with the wonderful judgment, wonderful for the moment, we have to see if the government forces Hiroshima City and Hiroshima Prefecture to appeal this judgment. But in that wonderful judgment, and going back to the reluctance to speak about radiation, which Kevin is absolutely right, Obama didn't refer to that. It's the last thing anyone wants to talk about. Nuclear power, new atomic bombs, do they have anything to do with radiation? I don't know about that. That is the way this has been handled. But many of the plaintiffs, those aging plaintiffs, aging brave plaintiffs, had been told by their parents, and this comes out in their personal narratives, that they were never to tell anyone that they had been exposed to black rain, or that's very common, I think, for the A-bomb survivors to have grown up determined, told, trained to keep it a secret, which is, again, which then shapes how Fukushima victims can or cannot speak to their experience.
So Jan, you were in the stack next. You're up.
I heard a story of a young girl who went to Richland High School as an exchange student from Japan. And she came from that city that I don't know the name of, Nakuda. That was
Nakuda.
How do you say that?
I just put it in. I just typed it in
chat.
Kokura.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, she came from Kokura, and she was an exchange student at Richland High. It had to be a kind of an amazing experience for her to be among the bombers, because that's their mascot, is the mushroom cloud, which is horrifying that high school students could be given that as their mascot. But I guess mascot's the right word. I always thought mascot was some kind of an animal, but anyway. I just wanted to bring that up because I thought it was a very, very interesting story, how she would tell people that the only reason she was there is that they bombed Nagasaki instead of Kokura. Do you know the story, Norma?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, probably we can find a link to it afterwards, but that is a video made with the encouragement of the art teacher of that school, to his immense credit, but it was only done after she was finished with the school year so she wouldn't face reprisals. I'm told that, maybe the Facebook group of the alums of Richland High School has pages that you would not want her to see. So it is, if you watch that video and you watch her peers, her high school peers, also being interviewed by a peer, my reaction was pity for those young American high schoolers who have been trained to be so ignorant, right? They had no idea about the impact of the bomb under the mushroom cloud. And they have no idea about how possibly they and their family members have been impacted by the production. And one of the things Yuki and I learned from going to Richland is that if you have a combination of employment and patriotism, it's pretty unbeatable. You know, we are the town that ended World War II, and by the way, it's made us prosperous.
Yeah.
Norma, I'm going to add a piece to what you just said. You've used the phrase a couple of times now, under the mushroom cloud. And I want to tell a story a little bit about someone who was not on the call, but who we have great admiration for. For the, I guess it was the 75th anniversary of the first chain reaction, the University of Chicago had a big event and a big hoopla at the Henry Moore sculpture. And one of the star attractions of this celebration was a artistic pyrotechnics exhibition. I forget the Chinese artist's name, but he was commissioned. Go ahead, Yuki, you want to say it?
Oh no, I was going to say well, it's Chinese, so I'm not probably saying.
Okay. Well, anyway, the idea was that at the appointed hour that allegedly matched the time when the first chain reaction occurred, this enormous pyrotechnics display in beautiful pastels of pink and aqua and whatever was set off at the University of Chicago. But to tie it back to Norma's statement about we don't think about what happens under the bomb, a University of Chicago student named India Weston, who's a bit of a maverick, got a bunch of her friends to do a die-in at the Henry Moore while this took place. And I believe it made the Hyde Park newspaper, but only in one line. But it's the point of we can't let them forget what happens under the mushroom cloud. And India just graduated this past year, and hopefully she'll continue that artistic tradition on. All right, let's see. We have Pat Walter on Stack. You want to unmute yourself, Pat, and go ahead.
Hi, very nice to hear and see all the discussion and in the presentations. To go back to the topic that Norma brought up at the beginning, just if you could clarify it a little bit. You said that you had some good news about this Black Rain lawsuit, that the court or somebody decided that there is such a thing as internal contamination. So what happens next? I mean, did the court decide that it could go forward? I mean, what happens next? What are the next steps or actions?
The 84 plaintiffs are to be officially recognized as hibakusha, as survivors. They are, I think Yuki can correct me on this, that means that they are entitled to a free annual exam. Hooray. I think every one of them convinced the judge has one of the 11 acknowledged illnesses acknowledged for exposure to the Black Rain, which then will entitle them to a hibakusha health booklet and free medical treatment. So the issue now is whether the central government will go along with this or insist that this decision be appealed. You can see how excruciating it is when you have plaintiffs the age that these people are, who have suffered the social stigma and illness and anxiety. If this decision were to be appealed, I think it would be an act of unpardonable cruelty and irresponsibility.
So there's no particular monetary recompense for this. This is a health coverage result.
It's health coverage. There's another much more stringent category of A-bomb related illness, which does provide, on top of the free healthcare, monetary support once a month, but the government has, despite court victories, and I don't quite understand this, I don't know if Yuki understands it better, how the bureaucracy can thwart a court decision. Maybe we understand it living in the United States right now, but the goal has absolutely been to keep that gate very, very narrow for the category of a bomb-related illness, which provides compensation.
It sounds a little bit similar to the Dark Waters story, although actually that was more complicated because they tried to do sort of a group court action, saying all these people were affected by the PFAS the same way that all of the residents of Japan were affected.
Mm-hmm.
So
there are lawsuits with many plaintiffs in Japan, but technically there is nothing comparable to our class action in the Japanese judicial system.
I see. Thank you.
Not that that's really here or there, but yeah.
Okay, we have two people on stack. I'm going to go to the person who hasn't had a chance to ask first, and then that's David Arietti, and then that'll be followed by Kevin. And then I want to do a little go round with you folks. So David, you have the floor.
I just have a comment. You know, I'm big on opera, and the Madame Butterfly that I was listening to is very pretty. You know, it takes place in Nagasaki. Are you aware of that? Puccini's opera. And so, you know, every time I hear it, or even the name, it reminds me of the atomic bomb. I just wanted to share that. You know, such a beautiful opera with such a horrible event. You know what I'm saying? Because I don't know if you know Puccini. I mean, his music is outstanding. And I just thought I'd mention it.
I think it's impossible for adults in Japan not to know about Madame Butterfly.
Oh, really?
It's about the asymmetry of knowledge that Yuki was talking about earlier. Japanese people, and probably, you know, it would be like 100% to 10 in terms of what Americans know about Japan versus what Japanese know about the United States. It's all about power and what the less powerful know about the powerful.
Right, and also that story about Madame Butterfly and Glover is another businessman at the time, and he has a mansion on a little hill and a very beautiful, not bucolic, very beautiful area, and that was intact from Nagasaki bombing. So sometimes those stories were used to cover up the bombing. The bombing was such a gloomy bombing. Sad stories are their stories, but we have this history which is much predated the bombing. We have a longer history of this trace and open to other worlds, and so that kind of narrative sometimes tried to overpower or used to cover up or downplay the atomic bombing in Nagasaki.
But David, that's not to say that the music isn't gorgeous.
Right, yeah, right. Not that I don't like the music.
I just wanted to mention it because, you know, it's such a beautiful music with such a horrible event. You know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah. Exactly.
Hey, Kevin, you're up next on stack.
Well, just to say thanks to Norma for clarifying in the chat. I think Linda might have remembered a story I told her about that prosecution of the 3 top TEPCO executives for the Fukushima catastrophe. And the part that was so inspiring to me was that there was this citizens panel that had an official say in whether or not the prosecution could be dropped, and they kept saying no. So the official prosecutors in Tokyo didn't want to pursue the charges, but the citizens panel at least twice, I think, said, no, you're not going to drop the charges. And I didn't know the update that there was going to be an appeal. So thanks for updating me.
It's also the fact that there is going to be an update is a very moving and inspiring thing, quite apart from whatever the outcome is, because because it was very clear that the official public prosecutors had no intention of indicting anybody on the Fukushima disaster. The court appointed 5 attorneys to serve as prosecutors. This is an unprecedentedly large number. And these attorneys gave their heart and soul and their time to 2 years. You can imagine the volume of documents and emails they had to go through to prepare for this trial. And they are all attorneys in private practice, so their practices are put on, on the shelf, so to speak. So it comes with some personal cost and enormous devotion to commit to another lengthy appeals process. And the most veteran of those attorneys serving as a prosecutor was so absorbed by this case that he went to Knight's Art School to learn photography, to be trained as a photographer. And then he just traveled through Fukushima by bus and took pictures from all these places where it's not safe to get out and walk around, and published a photography book called Fukushima Busscape.
I will go find the links to the Mountain of Waste 70 Years High conference, which is on our website, but I'll make it easier for you and put it in the chat box. And really do, Stephanie just held up the mug from that conference. It's a collector's item at this point. And would really strongly suggest that just listen to that first session, which is along the theme of where are the people? I twisted Norma's arm back then to make that her speaking point and her theme, and she did. And she also has her presentation, the keynote presentation that evening on the website. So that'll be there. And any comments you have on how to improve these sessions, we'd love to hear those as well in the comments section. So on that note, the last word is for our speakers. Who's first? You're on mute. Norma's on mute.
Let me go first so you can have the last word. Something I think about a lot is how quickly time has passed, more than usual recently. And at first it was all, in Japan, it was all Olympics, and suddenly it was COVID. And then here, Black Lives Matter, and globally. And I've been thinking how it's almost as, and before that, the nuclear weapons issue had really gotten forgotten. Climate change, global warming took over the attention of the young, for which I'm very grateful. But these things aren't either or. And just as I said, it wasn't a zero-sum game to have one set of survivors recognized, but it's all of these things that structurally, in fact, feed into each other. And I know Dave is a big fan of Greta Thunberg's Swedish activist. And I think she started out with that very powerful phrase, you grown-ups are stealing our future. It's theft of the future. And I think all of these forces we're confronting, including the economic issue, is theft of the future for the young and even of the present. And that's why, we only have 24 hours a day, I guess, and a few years, each of us, and many other responsibilities. So we can't work on everything all the time, but at least we can give room in our imaginations and our hearts to the fact that these crises are all interconnected. And I'm really grateful to have all of you to share tonight with. Thank you.
Thanks, Norma. And Yuki, you get the last word.
Ooh, I don't know about that, but thank you for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, Dave, and thank you, Nice, and thank you for all the audience. Thank you all the audience for you to be here tonight. And especially learning about Fukushima. I was tagging along with Norma, and I was able to meet people otherwise I wouldn't have known, and how difficult it is to talk about radiation. And also 2 years ago, Norma and I, with CORE members, CORE is Consequences of Radiation Exposure, a group of a handful of downwinders mainly, but others like Sarah Fox, whose book Norma was introducing earlier, and how difficult for people to be. Those people who hosted us in Richland, they were long-standing anti-nuclear weapon activists. Yet they don't acknowledge that their own victimization. Well, I would say they were suffering from radiation exposure from Hanford, but they wouldn't recognize it. There is to some extent, some self-denial. And since then, I've been thinking what I could do to have this Hibakusha identity to be construed. How can we acknowledge? And I myself have a long time, I wouldn't want to call it a self-denial. However, I was very conscious about calling myself as the second generation of Hibakusha. And so I've been thinking of that, and especially in that context, I'm so grateful to be given this opportunity. We can actually, and I was earlier half joking, but I'm not joking now, that we can use the term radiation and discuss it honestly, which is so priceless. Thank you so much.
Okay, Yuki, thank you. So I wanted you to meet each other. That's why I did that little go round. I also want you to know we had people here from Washington State, and as you know, from North Carolina, and we had Michiganders here tonight, and folks from Georgia and California. So when Norma asks, where are the people? Everywhere. And we got them here tonight. So I want to thank you all for joining us. This is our first go round. It was a few rough edges. We'll work those out. A reminder, if you want to save the chat, open the chat box now. Go to the bottom, all the way to the right. There's 3 little dots. Click those 3 little dots, and you'll be asked the question if you want to save it, and say yes, and you will have all of the links that are in the chat box. Also, Yuki and Norma, I would ask at some point if you would type in the URL for Atomic Age. That might be nice for people to see the website. It's a very good website. All right, so thank you all. This is our inaugural event. You made it happen is above and beyond, and we really appreciate you being here, and it's good to see a lot of old timers intermingling with a lot of new folks as well. So be well, stay well, raise hell.